history when the fabric of civilization seems to fray, when alliances are tested, when old hostilities reawaken with brutal clarity, and when the line between retaliation and escalation becomes dangerously thin. The recent strikes from Iran and Lebanon and the subsequent responses from the United States and Israel are not merely military engagements. They are manifestations of deeper, unresolved tensions, ideological, historical, and psychological, that have plagued the Middle East for generations. We are not dealing with isolated incidents. We are confronting patterns of vengeance, of mistrust, of narratives built over decades, if not centuries. And in the face of such complexity, many people retreat into cynicism, or worse, into tribalism. But neither of those responses is tenable if we are to avoid catastrophe. Stability in the Middle East hinges on individual responsibility, not just geopolitical strategy. This idea might seem counterintuitive at first. When we speak of the Middle East, of Iran, Israel, Lebanon, and the United States, we're often drawn immediately to discussions about military strength, intelligence networks, diplomatic maneuvering, sanctions, and oil. The discourse is saturated with terms like deterrence, proxy wars, and strategic interests. And yes, those are all real factors, vital ones. But they are not the whole picture. In fact, they are not even the foundation. Because beneath all the formal agreements, retaliatory strikes, and border skirmishes lies the individual thinking, acting, believing. The decisions of generals, diplomats, politicians, and citizens alike are ultimately shaped by what they hold to be true, what they value, and whether they have the courage to act on those values with integrity. And this is why, even amid the complexity of the region, responsibility at the level of the individual remains the essential, though often neglected, element of any lasting peace. When people abdicate responsibility, they become vessels for ideology. They become puppets of history, bound to repeat old cycles of blame and victimhood. This is visible across the region, where generations are raised with deeply entrenched narratives of grievance and mistrust. You cannot bomb that out of existence. You cannot negotiate it away in conference rooms, because what is at stake is not only territory or political leverage, but identity. People in the region do not merely inherit land, they inherit meaning systems, stories of who they are, who the enemy is, and what justice looks like. And these stories, left unchecked, calcify into dogma. Responsibility at the individual level means the willingness to examine those stories critically, to ask where they came from, and whether they are helping or harming the possibility of peace. Governments often respond to crises with force, because force is quick, decisive, and measurable. Responsibility, on the other hand, is slow, personal, and messy. But it's also the only thing that scales upward and holds everything else together. If a leader is not first responsible for his own speech, his own biases, his own willingness to hear opposing views, then he cannot be trusted to make decisions that affect millions. And if ordinary people are unwilling to challenge the extremism in their own communities, to listen to a different narrative, to vote with discernment, or refuse to celebrate acts of revenge, then the conditions for peace disintegrate, no matter how many treaties are signed. The myth is that peace is maintained through strength alone, that as long as the weapons are bigger and the intelligence more precise, stability will follow. But that's a fragile illusion. Strength without moral clarity becomes tyranny. Strategy without personal virtue becomes manipulation. Nations become no different than gangs when the individuals running them lack the maturity to take responsibility for their own motivations and actions. That's why authoritarian regimes often crumble from within, because responsibility is replaced by fear, and fear cannot build anything lasting. In a flashpoint like the Middle East, the stakes are amplified, but the principle remains universal. You cannot build external order without internal discipline. If people, leaders, soldiers, civilians, are not willing to tell the truth, confront the corruption in their own ranks, and sacrifice short-term pride for long-term peace, then violence becomes inevitable. Not because of fate, but because people chose avoidance over responsibility. Every time a missile is launched, there are 1,000 unseen decisions that made it possible. A teacher who didn't challenge a hateful ideology in his classroom. A journalist who chose propaganda over truth. A bureaucrat who ignored a warning sign. A citizen who applauded vengeance instead of mourning loss. These are not abstract examples. They are real. They add up. The culture that grows around conflict either feeds it or diffuses it. And culture is not built from the top down. It's built through what individuals tolerate, what they endorse, and what they demand. And so, if we truly want to understand stability in the Middle East, or anywhere, it requires us to look deeper than airstrikes and alliances. We must look at ourselves, at the individual conscience, at the daily choices people make when no one is watching, because those choices do not vanish. They accumulate. They shape the environment in which decisions are made, conflicts are justified, and futures are imagined. Ideological possession is as dangerous as military aggression in perpetuating conflict. When we think of conflict in the Middle East, we instinctively picture violence. Missile strikes, armored convoys, burning buildings,